New Flyer is a North American leader in transit bus design and manufacture. The diesel hybrid Excelsior 40-foot low-floor transit bus, designed and manufactured for the San Francisco Municipal Transit Authority, is an example of this leadership. This presentation will familiarize service personnel with the disc brakes on the Excelsior 40-foot hybrid bus. It will cover front hub servicing and rotor replacement. The operators and maintenance guides that accompany the vehicle are the final authority with respect to safety, maintenance, and operational parameters. Consult the guides or your supervisor should you have any questions or require additional information. 3 types of headings are used in the maintenance guide to attract your attention. Danger indicates a hazardous situation which, if not avoided, will result in death or serious injury. Warning is used when an operating procedure or practice, if not correctly followed, could result in personal injury or loss of life. Caution is used when an operating procedure or practice, if not strictly observed, could result in damage to or destruction of equipment. These headings will be used in this presentation where appropriate. Safety. Service personnel must follow all MUNI, OSHA, and New Flyer safety rules and regulations. Always ensure that the vehicle is appropriately hoisted and blocked for procedures that require elevating the vehicle. Note: components for the wheel end are extremely heavy. One must use caution and specialized lifting tools to disassemble and assemble the wheel end components. Only use tools that are in good working condition. Note: only use tools and accessories and genuine MAN parts that have been expressly approved by MAN AG. Note: final tightening torque of all fasteners must be performed manually using a calibrated torque wrench. For the purposes of this presentation, the balance of the video will feature an axle and brake assembly removed from the bus for better views. Front axle and suspension. The front axle and suspension installation consists of a MAN VOK-07F low-floor axle, complete with wheel hub assembly, brake caliper and brake disc assembly, center link assembly, tie rod arms, and a steering arm. The axle assembly also includes ABS sensor and pulse generating wheel. The brake chambers are mounted directly on the disc brake caliper assembly. Wheel hub bearing inspection. Raise the vehicle and support the front axle on jack stands. Ensure the brakes are released and the wheels can rotate freely. Attach the base of a magnetic dial gauge to any part of the steering knuckle. Align the dial gauge pin perpendicular to the face of the brake rotor and as close as possible to the outer edge of the brake disc. Also, ensure the dial gauge pin is located at either the 6 o'clock or 12 o'clock position. Note: it is important that the dial gauge pin be positioned at the correct distance from the center of the brake disc in order to obtain an accurate reading. The tip of the gauge should be resting approximately 8.25 to 8.5 inches, 210 to 215 millimeters from the center of the disc. Zero the dial gauge. Grasp the wheel at the top and bottom, rock back and forth while observing the dial indicator reading. Note: if clearance issues resulted in the dial gauge being positioned somewhere other than 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock, then ensure the wheel is grasped at a location that corresponds to the dial gauge. As an example, if the dial gauge was located at the 2 o'clock position, then grasp the wheel at the 2 o'clock and 8 o'clock positions and rock back and forth. If total movement exceeds 0.010 inches or 0.25 millimeters, replace the wheel hub as an assembly. Brake disc rotor. Lateral runout inspection. Due to different application of brakes for different driving conditions, rotors may develop runout. If the runout is below the permissible level, 0.15 millimeters, the rotor does not need to be renewed. The rotor should be skimmed and reused up to the minimum rotor thickness allowable. Measure the distance between the pad and tappet on both sides of each caliper. The distance should be more than 1 millimeter. Measure the wheel hub play. Make sure the hub play is within the acceptable range. Mount a dial gauge with magnetic base to a rigid location. The tip of the dial gauge must be perpendicular to the rotor. Position the tip 35 millimeters down from the outer rim of the rotor. Rotate the rotor a complete rotation to find the maximum runout. The maximum allowable runout is 0.15 millimeters. If the bus is vibrating due to warped rotors, turn brake rotor on vehicle. Take off only the material needed to achieve an even contact pattern. This repair option is not only cost-effective, but also the better remedial measure because new brake rotors can always deform during the initial phase of use. These deformations are permanently eliminated by turning and will not subsequently reoccur. Hot spots on the frictional face cannot be removed by taking off small amounts of material. If a rotor is affected by such hot spots, it must be replaced. Warning: wheel brake failure can result due to a defective combination brake chamber. Removing the brake chamber. Using a 24 millimeter socket or wrench, remove the brake chamber mounting nuts and discard. Move the brake chamber away from the brake caliper. Clean the mating faces of the brake chamber and the brake caliper. Insert a clean, suitably sized plug into the brake cylinder bore on the brake caliper or cover with a piece of tape. Inspecting the brake chamber. Check the tappet chamber for dirt. The tappet chamber must be free from dirt and water. Inspect the seal protrusion. Note, if the seal protrusion does not meet the required specification of 3 millimeters, the chamber must be replaced. Careful attention is needed. Note, replace the brake chamber retaining nuts each time the brake chamber is removed. Disassemble brake pads. Remove the disc pad retaining lever, pin clip, pin, and lever.
I'm going to be careful here when I'm pressing. The bridge. At this point, shoes are loose.
Note, it may be necessary to increase the pad running clearance to facilitate disc pad removal. Removing the caliper and carrier assembly. Note, the tie rod arm must be removed to access the lower carrier mounting bolts. Use an internal Torx socket and socket wrench assembly. Remove 2 M22 bolts from tie rod arm. Note, be sure to secure the brake caliper to prevent it from falling prior to removing the mounting bolts. Serious personal injury could result if the brake caliper and carrier is allowed to fall. Install the caliper support fixture.
Most of the time I very seldom use this thing because it's awkward to handle.
Remove the 6 M18 external Torx head bolts that retain the entire caliper and carrier assembly to the steering knuckle and remove the entire caliper and carrier assembly from vehicle. Removing wheel hub flange. Assemble flange bolt removal tool and place tool onto 2 flange mounting bolts. Use a special tool to loosen all the flange mounting bolts. Support the wheel flange and completely remove the mounting bolts.
Yeah, Yes.
Note, an E24 socket can be used to remove the flange bolts. Remove the flange from the brake disc.
Flange comes off.
Removing brake disc. Thread the alignment pins through the brake disc into opposite-facing tapped holes in the hub unit. Use the lifting hook to remove the brake disc from the wheel hub by pulling it over the alignment pins. Note, this unit is very heavy, Special attention is needed at this time. Removing hub nut. Install slotted nut socket onto slotted nut. Install counter holder flange, torque multiplier, counter holder, and torque reaction arms on end of hub and over the slotted nut socket. Anchor the counter holder's torque reaction arms solidly and turn hex on torque multiplier to loosen slotted nut.
Full operation, eh?
Remove the special tools from the hub.
Or you're still
Then remove the slotted nut and thrust washer.
one.
Note: discard and do not reuse the slotted nut. Thread the fitting sleeve onto end of spindle and carefully pull hub assembly off the spindle.
You got that? Yeah.
Removing hub mechanically. Note: if the hub assembly does not slide off the spindle, then it will be necessary to remove the fitting sleeve and assemble the mechanical removal tools. Bolt the puller removal flange onto the hub. Install threaded bushing, puller cap, and spindle screw into the puller removal flange. Rotate the spindle screw to pull off hub unit assembly from the steering knuckle spindle. Hub unit. The hub unit wheel bearing is not adjustable and has a lifetime grease filling. The hub unit wheel bearing, radio shaft seal, and ABS pulse wheel form a single encapsulated unit. Installing the hub unit bearing. Lubricate steering knuckle spindle and hub bearings with Molykote D paste. Apply a very thin coating of paste to the area where the inner races seat. Thread the fitting sleeve onto the end of the spindle. Install the hub assembly onto guide sleeve and push the hub until it is fully seated.
Once it's on,
Installing the hub unit bearing using puller tools. Note: if the hub assembly cannot be fully seated by hand, then use a hub installation tools and the following procedure. Bolt puller flange onto the end of the hub.
until it seats.
Install puller assembly onto the puller flange. Thread end of puller screw into the end of the fitting sleeve and turn handle on the puller to push hub assembly onto the spindle. Remove the assembly of the special tools, including the fitting sleeve from the steering knuckle spindle. Install thrust washer and a new slotted nut and hand tighten.
Sure it's in there.
Note: when installing nut and thrust washer, make sure the thrust washer is placed behind the nut and on the flat cutaway of the spindle properly before torquing the retaining nut.
The threads will be very difficult to turn. Now,
Tightening hub nut to specified torque. Install slotted nut socket onto slotted nut. Install counter holder flange on end of the hub and over slotted nut socket.
oh yeah,
So in 1987, had you as a mechanic on
Torque the slotted nut to 546 foot-pounds or 740 Newton meters. Note: the hub nut can be torqued with the torque multiplier, making sure to consider the ratio of 1 to 8. Set the torque wrench to 68.2 foot-pounds or 92.5 Newton meters. Remove special tools.
we do.
Install brake disc. Inspect the threaded holes in the wheel hub unit and remove any accumulated grease or debris. Clean the contact surface between the wheel hub unit and the brake disc. Apply a thin layer of Molykote D high-performance lubricant around the contact surface of the hub unit. Ensure grease is applied to the complete circumference and face of the hub unit. Install the brake disc onto the hub unit, using the alignment pins to guide the brake disc into position. Install the wheel flange. Use the flange bolt tool to torque 12 Torx head bolts in a cross-tightening pattern to 288 foot-pounds or 390 Newton meters. The flange bolt tool is a torque multiplier with a ratio of 1 to 3.5. For a final torque of 288 foot-pounds, 390 Newton meters, set the torque wrench to 82 foot-pounds or 111 Newton meters. Install disc brake and caliper assembly with carrier. Use the man lifting tool to mount the brake caliper with the carrier on the axle housing. Note, the unit is heavy and assistance is recommended for installation. Install new mounting bolts and tighten them to initial torque of 250 Newton meters or 184 foot-pounds. Tighten the mounting bolts to a final torque of 390 Newton meters or 287.5 foot-pounds. Special note, when torquing the carrier bolts, the angle starting from 184 foot-pounds to reach 287.5 foot-pounds must not exceed 60 degrees. If movement to achieve final torque exceeds 60 degrees, the bolts may have been stretched and need to be replaced. Repeat the two-stage torquing procedure in such cases. Remove the fixture when complete. Install tie rod arm. Reinstall tie rod arm using 2 new self-locking bolts. Use internal torque socket and torque wrench assembly and torque bolts to specification, 500 foot-pounds. Note, if the tie rod end has been separated from the tie rod arm, discard and replace the self-locking nut with a new nut. Torque nut to 221 foot-pounds or 300 Newton meters. Install the brake pads. Push the brake caliper towards the axle differential. Insert the inner brake pad into the brake caliper guide channel. Insert the outer brake pad into the brake caliper guide channel. Note, a new rotor requires new pads. Insert the brake pad holding clip. Secure the brake pad holding clip with the pin, the washer, and a new spring clip. Note, it is recommended to replace the spring clip as necessary. Position the pin with the clip facing towards the ground. Apply a small amount of silicone to the spring clip to keep it secured. Install the brake chamber. Remove installed protective covering from caliper brake chamber mounting hole. Inspect the brake caliper cylinder hole for dirt and contaminants. Clean if necessary. Apply white lithium grease to the spherical cap and the actuating lever. Inspect brake chamber boot seal for protrusion of 3 millimeters or 0.118 inches. Note, the brake chamber mounting bolts must be replaced each time the brake chamber is removed. Screw on the new mounting nuts and tighten them to 190 Newton meters or 140 foot-pounds. Setting brake pad running clearance. Remove the protective adjuster boot. Using a shear adapter placed on the adjuster, turn the adjuster at the adjuster screw until the brake pads abut the brake disc. Turn the adjuster using the adjuster screw back by 2 clicks of the adjuster. Inspecting running clearance between disc pad and rotor. Using the man feeler gauge, check the clearance between the brake pads and the brake disc tappet and adjust using the adjuster screw if necessary. The clearance between the brake pads and the brake disc tappet must be 0.027 inches or 0.7 millimeters, to 0.047 inches or 1.2 millimeters. Pack the protective cap with multi-purpose grease LiPF2 and then install the cap. Confirm all components are clear. Install wheels and tires and torque to 450 to 500 foot-pounds. Recheck torque after 50 to 100 miles or 80 to 160 kilometers of operation. This concludes the front hub and rotor maintenance orientation on the Excelsior XDE 40-foot bus. Should you require further information, consult your New Flyer service manual or your supervisor.